Hi friends, welcome to the next video of 12 sets of 9 WH questions. We are learning these 12 sets so that it will be easy for us to ask questions and to answer to those questions. We are going to develop our vocabulary, we are going to develop our pronunciation, and we are going to develop our neutral accent. The more videos you are going to watch, the more fluent you are going to become. I am trying to help you in many ways, and this is one way of helping you to learn fluent English. I am going to write the 12 WHOs on the board, and I am going to frame those sentences for you. Please observe how we go about. "12 sets of 9 WH questions. What, where, when, why, who, whose, whom, which, and how." These are the 9 WH questions that we are going to frame over here, and the sentence that we are going to use is: they narrate stories. Based upon this sentence, we are going to use these WHs. First one is what? What do they do? Answer: they narrate stories. Second one: where do they narrate stories? They narrate stories in villages. Third one: when do they narrate stories? They narrate stories during fairs and festivals. Okay, fourth one: why do they narrate stories? They narrate stories because it's their profession. Fifth one: who narrates stories? They narrate stories. Sixth one. For whose purpose do they narrate stories? They narrate stories for the villagers' purpose. Seventh one. With whom do they narrate stories? They narrate stories with the group members. Eighth one. Which stories do they narrate? They narrate the epic stories. Ninth one. How do they narrate stories? They narrate stories by singing and explaining. Okay friends, based upon this sentence, we have framed these 9 WH questions and we have answered accordingly. Some sentences may repeat. That you need not worry. It is only for the sentence sake that we have framed it. Now first one, what do? They narrate stories. Where do they narrate stories? They narrate stories in villages. When do they narrate stories? They narrate stories during fairs and festivals. Why do they narrate stories? They narrate stories because it's their profession. Why? Okay. Who narrates stories? They narrate stories. For whose purpose do they narrate stories? They narrate stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom do they narrate stories? They narrate stories with the group members. Which stories do they narrate? They narrate the epic stories. How do they narrate stories? They narrate stories by singing and explaining. Let's go to the second set. What did they do? They narrated stories. Where did they narrate stories? They narrated stories in the villages. When did they narrate stories? They narrated stories during fairs and festivals. Why did they narrate stories? They narrated stories because it was their profession. Who narrated stories? They narrated stories. For whose purpose did they narrate stories? They narrated stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom did they narrate stories? They narrated stories with the group members. Which stories did they narrate? They narrated the epic stories. How did they narrate stories? They narrated stories by singing and explaining them. Okay, third set. What will they do? They will narrate stories. Where will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories in villages. When will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories during fairs and festivals. Why will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories because it's their profession. Who will narrate stories? They will narrate stories. For whose purpose will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories with the group members. Which stories will they narrate? They will narrate the epic stories. How will they narrate stories? They will narrate stories by singing and explaining them. Now we are going to the fourth set. What are they doing? They are narrating stories. Where are they narrating stories? They are narrating stories in villages. When are they narrating stories? They are narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why are they narrating stories? They are narrating stories because it's their profession. Who is narrating stories? They are narrating stories. For whose purpose are they narrating stories? They are narrating the stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom are they narrating stories? They are narrating stories with the group members. Which stories are they narrating? They are narrating the epic stories. How are they narrating stories? They are narrating stories by singing and explaining them. Now we will go to the fifth one. What were they doing? They were narrating stories. Where were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories in villages. When were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories because it was their profession. Who was narrating stories? They were narrating stories. For whose purpose were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories with the group members. Which stories were they narrating? They were narrating the epic stories. How were they narrating stories? They were narrating stories by singing and explaining. So we are going to the sixth one. What will they be doing? They will be narrating stories. Where will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories in villages. When will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories because it's their profession. Who will be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories. For whose purpose will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating their stories with the group members. Which stories will they be narrating? They will be narrating the epic stories. How will they be narrating stories? They will be narrating stories by singing and explaining. So now we come to the seventh one. What have they done? They have narrated stories. Where have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories in villages. When have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories during fairs and festivals. Why have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories because it's their profession. Who has narrated stories? They have narrated stories. For whose purpose have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories with the group members. Which stories have they narrated? They have narrated the epic stories. How have they narrated stories? They have narrated stories by singing and explaining. That takes us to the eighth one. What had they done? They had narrated stories. Where had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories in villages. When had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories during fairs and festivals. Why had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories because it was their profession. Who had narrated stories? They had narrated stories. For whose purpose had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories with the group members. Which stories had they narrated? They had narrated the epic stories. How had they narrated stories? They had narrated stories by singing and explaining. That takes us to the ninth one. What will they have done? They will have narrated stories. Where will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories in villages. When will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories during fairs and festivals. Who will have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories. Why will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories because it's their profession. For whose purpose will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories for the village's purpose. With whom will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories with their group members. Which stories will they have narrated? They will have narrated the epic stories. How will they have narrated stories? They will have narrated stories by singing and explaining. That takes us to the 10th one. What have they been doing? They have been narrating stories. Where have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories in the villages. When have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories because it's their profession. Who had been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories. For whose purpose have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories with the group members. Which stories have they been narrating? They have been narrating the epic stories. How have they been narrating stories? They have been narrating stories by singing and explaining. That takes us to the 11th set. What had they been doing? They had been narrating stories. Where had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories in the villages. When had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories because it was their profession. Who had been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories. For whose purpose had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories with the group members. Which stories had they been narrating? They had been narrating the epic stories. How had they been narrating stories? They had been narrating stories by singing and explaining. That takes us to the final set. That is the 12th set. What will they have been doing? They will have been narrating stories. Where will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories in the villages. When will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories during fairs and festivals. Why will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories because it's their profession. Who will have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories. For whose purpose will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories for the villagers' purpose. With whom will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories with the group members. Which stories will they have been narrating? They will have been narrating the epic stories. Why will they have been narrating stories? They will have been narrating stories by singing and explaining. Friends, once you practice along with me, you will observe the pronunciation, the accent and the speed in which I go. In the beginning you will be going slowly, that is in the previous videos, and later you are going to pick up speed. When you pick up speed, you will be able to answer questions fastly. Okay. Now I want you to please keep practicing on clicking on my videos. The more videos you are going to watch, the more fluent you are going to speak English. I wish you all the best.